Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers Review the Week, where we bring you the best of the past 7 days. Over the next 30 minutes, as the fallout from the Panama Papers rolls on, we'll be looking at the rise of leaktivism and how hackers and whistleblowers are changing the world we live in. We'll also be discussing the death penalty with a man who was exonerated after spending 12 years on death row, and examining the treatment of Myanmar's Muslim minority. Over the past decade, hackers, leakers and whistleblowers have provided us with a growing amount of data about the world we live in and the power structures under which we live. From WikiLeaks to the Panama Papers, data leaks are giving us unprecedented access into the inner workings of the rich and powerful. The Newsmakers' Sandra Gartman filed this report.
Whistleblowers are increasingly holding the world's elite to account. They've exposed state secrets, criminal and immoral activity, and have forced world leaders to answer tough questions as the world becomes increasingly digital. The ability to blow the whistle on vast amounts of information is becoming easier. In 2010, U.S. Marine Chelsea Manning leaked classified and sensitive military documents and diplomatic cables to WikiLeaks. It was hugely controversial and has been pointed to as the catalyst of Tunisia's Jasmine Revolution. In 2013, National Security Agency contractor Edward Snowden revealed mass surveillance by US and UK intelligence agencies. It triggered new legislation in the UK, and Silicon Valley companies have increased their encryption software. And this month, the Panama Papers exposed dozens of the world's political and business elite linked to offshore accounts. Iceland's Prime Minister has stepped down over the scandal, and British Prime Minister David Cameron has had to release details of his personal taxes after his late father was named as having an offshore account. With the growing scale of leaks, news organizations are increasingly collaborating, and outlets like the New York Times, The Guardian, and Al Jazeera have dedicated online folders to receive leaks. With such networks in place and so many ways to access information, elites are now finding it difficult to keep information out of public view. Mossack Fonseca, the law firm behind the Panama Papers. It says its data was obtained through an external hack, and that it was the victim of a crime. Hacktivism like this is increasingly being used as a tool to enforce change and hold people accountable.
We are held by a code of honor to protect those who are defenseless.
Groups like Anonymous have declared cyber war on a range of targets, from Daesh to the BBC to Donald Trump and even other hacker groups. Hacktivism and whistleblowing claim to work towards a perceived greater good, and are tools that give power back to the people. But is a crime to reveal another crime or injustice really justified? In the wake of Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden, the United States has cracked down on whistleblowers. More have been prosecuted under President Barack Obama's watch than all previous presidents combined, and he established the Insider Threat Program to detect and deter insider spies. But as authorities become defenseless in the battle for information control, will leaktivism increasingly hold the political elite to account? Or does it pose more of a threat to the greater good? Sandra Gartman, The Newsmakers.
On Monday, my colleague Matthew Moore was joined by Ray McGovern and Fred Fleitz, two former CIA analysts who took very different positions. Here's Fleitz's response when he was asked who was winning the battle between the authorities and the activists.
I think the activists may have a slight upper hand, but at the same time, I think government and industry are going to improve encryption. And I think in some cases, there will be computer systems that will be simply completely isolated from the internet for sensitive corporate communications because they can't be sure that it will be possible to protect them from hackers.
Mr. McGovern, where do you see this going?
The objective of that system, of course, would be to hide government crimes. I see the upper hand being given to very, very ideologically driven people. And it's okay to be ideological about seeking the truth. That's what we have here. That's what I did as a CIA analyst working for just one master, the analysis master, the truth, And that's what we have with people who reveal abuses of our Constitution, because there's no other vehicle with which to do this.
When the United States votes for a new president this year, there will, as usual, be a candidate from each of the two biggest parties, and one of them will take his or her place in the White House. But is the U.S. ready for something different from the status quo? The Newsmakers' Jerome Evans filed this report on Tuesday.
The Republicans and the Democrats. The two parties have long dominated US politics. While it's not technically impossible for other parties to make it into the White House, in reality, the infrastructure and funding needed make America's political system a two-horse race. But this year's presidential hopefuls are appealing to the fringes rather than the party faithful. Republican frontrunner Donald Trump. The Washington outsider is appealing to a new kind of Republican voter. But many see him as divisive, and he has the Republican old guard closing ranks on him.
At what point do we say enough is enough? He is a disaster.
Donald Trump will be an embarrassment to America.
His imagination must not be married to real power.
The status quo is also being challenged on the other end of the spectrum. Bernie Sanders, a democratic socialist. He's anti-Wall Street, anti-lobbyists, and anti the Washington establishment. He stood as an independent in the US Senate, but is campaigning on the Democratic ticket. He's been scathing of the Democrats in the past, but in a two-party system, the Democrats were perhaps his most viable option. Polarization has become a defining feature of the US political landscape. Once both placed close to the centre, the Republicans and Democrats are now both less diverse and further apart than at any point in the last 2 decades. Bitter animosity along party lines has risen, creating stumbling blocks to reform in Congress. And as politicians have become polarised and pitted against each other, so too has American society, with the share of Republicans who dislike Democrats jumping from 17 to 43% in the last 20 years. Likewise, Democrats with negative opinions about Republicans has more than doubled from 16 to 38%. And the vast majority see the policies of the opposing party as a threat to the nation's well-being. With this political structure set in stone, some in the US are asking whether it's time to bring more diversity and options to the mainstream. But could the US move away from its two-party tradition?
Simply for any of the other parties that exist in the United States, they just simply don't have the money, the infrastructure, and the national notoriety to put a candidate up who is competitive.
Any change to a new political dynamic would require reform to level the playing field.
If you're a member of the Democratic or the Republican Party, you don't want to give away any of your power. You don't want to give an advantage to somebody else who might come in and make you less relevant.
And the change candidates like Trump and Sanders threaten to bring is also at risk of being stamped out. Both parties have superdelegates or rules in place so that undesirable candidates can essentially be vetoed by the party elite. Republicans and Democrats seem unlikely to loosen the firm grip they have on US politics. And for some, that's all the more reason why a change is needed. Jerome Evans, The Newsmakers.
On Tuesday, my colleague Matthew Moore spoke to an alternative presidential candidate, the Green Party's Jill Stein. This is what she believes needs to be done to reform America's election system.
In the presidential race, we need a reform called ranked choice voting. It lets you rank your choices instead of just voting for one person, and it guarantees that if you vote for an underdog based on your principles and your beliefs, and that underdog loses, your vote is reassigned to your second choice. We could actually pass that right now. The states have the authority to pass that in their legislatures. So that any possibility for splitting the vote could be preempted right now. My campaign, this was when I first ran for office in 2002, running for governor against Mitt Romney. My campaign helped get that legislation filed in the Massachusetts legislature so there would be no splitting of the vote. But the Democrats rely on fear in order to keep their voters voting for them. So they will continue to do that. This is not This is not a reform that's going to go down easily. We're going to have to push this in every way that we can.
Last month, history was made as a new civilian-led government was sworn in Myanmar after decades of military rule. But this democratic transition has yet to include the country's Muslim minority. Hundreds of thousands of Rohingya Muslims were barred from voting in the elections, and many still live in camps, segregated from society. On Wednesday, the Newsmakers' Duncan Crawford sent this report from Myanmar's Rakhine state.
A country left divided by years of religious conflict. A people left stateless who say they've been persecuted for decades. After oppression under military rule, there's now hope and some expectation that the Muslim Rohingya can have a better future. At the moment, they aren't recognised as citizens in the country of their birth. And conflict in 2012 between Buddhists and Muslims forced more than 100,000 Rohingya to live in camps where they remain cut off from the rest of society. With a new civilian-led government now in power in Myanmar, we came to Rakhine State to see whether anything will change. Fences and checkpoints have separated Myanmar's religious communities in Rakhine State for nearly 4 years. Buddhists and Rohingya Muslims divided by suspicion and barbed wire. And for the Muslims now stuck in camps, like Norjan, there is little to look forward to. Cut off from the outside world and surrounded by hostile neighbours, she's trapped in a place called Ongmingala. It's effectively a prison. The authorities say the Rohingya can't leave here to protect them from the Buddhists outside. Since 2012, it's been so difficult, so hard to survive, she tells me. Everyone is unemployed in my home. The building has almost collapsed. In a separate camp, young widow Hassana holds a picture of her husband with her children. Her family says he was murdered by a Buddhist mob in the violence nearly 4 years ago, and they now have little hope for the future. Myanmar's former military-backed government made little effort to heal the wounds. In Sitwe, before the violence of 2012, Buddhists and Muslims used to live side by side, but there have always been tensions. While most Rohingya say they've lived here for generations, Buddhist nationalists have long argued that they are immigrants, mainly from Bangladesh. That's the view of leading monk Shishati. He tells me there is a need to build mutual trust, but in the next breath says many Rohingya should be kicked out of the country. We have to determine which Muslims can be citizens and which cannot, he says. Muslims created this situation and we cannot trust them. Each new generation here is being brought up to distrust the communities around them. Ending years of suspicion will be difficult. We don't want to have problems, but we want to be separate, this man says. If we don't live together, things will be okay. Myanmar may have taken steps towards democracy, but Rohingya Muslims aren't yet part of it. The legacy of violence between Buddhists and Muslims still haunts the country, and rebuilding trust between neighbours who once killed each other will take years. The Rohingya hope the country's new democratic leaders will try to heal the wounds. Duncan Crawford, The Newsmakers, Rakhine State, Myanmar.
Last year, more people were executed by governments than in any other year since 1989. But for the first time in history, the majority of the world's countries did not use capital punishment. But why are those states that do still have it use it now more than ever? The Newsmakers' Yvette McCullough filed this report on Thursday.
State-sanctioned killings, the ultimate punishment handed down for heinous crimes. Despite growing global condemnation and more countries choosing to abolish, last year saw the highest number of executions worldwide in more than 25 years. According to Amnesty International, at least 1,634 people were executed in 25 countries in 2015. Most were carried out in 5 countries: China, Iran, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the US. Amnesty says the figures in China are unclear, but it believes thousands were executed there.
This organization you mentioned often has some biased reviews on China, and we don't have comment on that.
Iran alone accounted for 82% of executions in the Middle East, with at least 977. Pakistan lifted a 6-year moratorium on execution of civilians in December 2014, following a Taliban attack on a school in Peshawar. Last year, it executed 326 people. 158 were executed in Saudi Arabia in 2015, a 76% increase on the previous year, while 28 people were put to death in the US. But on the other hand, 4 more countries banned the death penalty in 2015, and Mongolia will abolish it later this year. The United States, a leading world power, a beacon of democracy, and a champion of human rights. It was also the 5th highest executor in 2015. While the numbers are falling, 7 fewer were executed than in 2014, and it was the lowest number since 1991. But 31 states still have the death penalty, and pressure to end it is mounting. The EU has an export ban on the drugs used in lethal injections, and stocks are running low.
What happened in Oklahoma is deeply troubling.
In September 2014, convicted murderer and rapist Clayton Lockett was given a concoction of drugs in what should have been a fast-working lethal injection. But he lived for 43 minutes in apparent pain.
In the application of the death penalty in this country, we have seen significant problems. Racial bias, an uneven application, situations in which there were individuals on death row who later on were discovered to have been innocent because of exculpatory evidence.
For the majority of Americans, the death penalty is a vital part of the justice system. According to Pew Research, 56% agree with it for those convicted of murder. But overall support is declining. It's as low as it's been in 40 years. With questions about the fairness of trials and whether capital punishment does work as a deterrent, many within the US and around the world say it's time for it to be abolished completely. Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me on Thursday's edition of The Newsmakers was Anthony Graves, a man who spent 12 years on death row before being exonerated, and John Lott, the president of the Crime Prevention Research Center. This is what happened when I asked John if he felt comfortable that the US sat alongside countries such as China and Iran in keeping the death penalty.
Look, I mean, they execute for completely different reasons. For China, it's a lot to do with political stuff. There's no political executions that occur in the United States. You have to go and murder multiple people. They have to be special circumstances that are there. We have terrorism that occurs. I mean, you mentioned 28 people were executed in the United States, and all those other countries, you were talking about, you know, thousands in China, hundreds in other countries that are there. The issue is, why do we do it in the United States? We do it, at least a lot of people do it, in order to try to save other lives.
Okay.
And so that seems to me a completely different reason for doing it.
Okay, Anthony Graves, the US is different from other countries because you do it to try to save other lives. There are no political executions. Final word from you.
Well, I just go back to the fact that whether you believe in the death penalty or not, I think that's a personal choice. It definitely is, but I don't think our emotions should govern our society. It should come from a rational state of mind. And I believe that when we're shown that 156 men have been exonerated from this inhumane punishment, that means that common sense says that someone didn't make it, and we've executed someone innocent. Now, are we comfortable with that? Because we are executing mostly guilty people. But if we execute a few along the way that are innocent, are we comfortable with that? It doesn't matter about what you believe in. Are you comfortable with executing innocent people?
On Thursday, a Russian military jet flew within 10 meters of a US warship in the Baltic Sea in what the White House says was one of the riskiest encounters for decades. The The Newsmakers' Simon McGregor-Wood sent this report from Estonia, where many have been fearful of a surge in tensions.
Russia's actions in Ukraine and Crimea have sent shockwaves through Eastern Europe. Poland and the 3 Baltic states fear they could be next. NATO plans to send more troops and equipment to deter any Russian aggression. The US will quadruple its spending on European defense, $3.4 billion in 2017 alone.
Mr. Putin, in my second term, has had an increasing tendency to view the world through a Cold War prism.
This statement that Russia is a security threat is used by countries that want to portray Russia as an enemy.
We will not compromise on the principles on which our alliance and the security of Europe and North America rest.
250 US tanks and armoured vehicles will be deployed on NATO's eastern borders. 4,200 new US troops will be rotated through the vulnerable NATO states each year. Will this be enough to reassure nervous NATO allies? Will it provoke the Kremlin? Estonia is one NATO country feeling the chill wind of Russia's new aggressive posture. TRT World has gained exclusive access to an Estonian government document which demands an even greater increase in NATO presence in the Baltic region. It calls for 2 combat-ready brigades. That's around 10,000 troops. It wants 2 squadrons of fighter aircraft, about 40 planes. And it wants the US to maintain a permanent naval presence in the Baltic Sea. Estonia's politicians are convinced they need this level of commitment.
But Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania are frontline nations. NATO has to create more visible deterrence.
For now, Estonia must rely on its volunteers, like this group, learning how to take out enemy vehicles with a mine. 15,000 unpaid part-time soldiers, the first line of defense against Russian incursion. Lisa Maimets is a teacher, learning how to lay an anti-tank mine.
I do feel the threat, and that's why I believe that it's important to be ready. So this kind of action here is very important, I think.
In the last 2 years, the number of people joining Estonia's Defence League has gone up by 10%, a link, some would say, with Russia's actions in Ukraine. It is clear that some Estonians do perceive a new level of threat from their Russian neighbour. Just like Ukraine, Estonia has its own Russian minority. Here in Narva, 90% are ethnically Russian. Moved here in Soviet times, communist factories have closed, unemployment has gone up. Many feel left out. There are some concerns that just as in Ukraine and just as in Crimea, the grievances of the Russian minority here might be manipulated by Russia, creating a pretext for a much more obvious intervention. Estonia's weekend warriors practice repelling a Russian incursion. They fear, without a much bigger and more visible NATO deterrence here, they would quickly be overrun. Simon McGregor-Wood, The Newsmakers, Estonia.
In our Picture This of the week, protesters in France have been holding all-night demonstrations against changes to labour laws, and they're set to continue despite the government's offer of concessions. Let's take a look. Well, that was the week that was, a week in which we looked at the rise of leaktivism, a new way people are holding authorities and power to account. And we also discussed the death penalty and whether it has a place in modern society. Next week, we'll be looking at the Occupy protests and asking whether they can lead to change. And on Friday, we'll have an exclusive look inside one of the world's most secretive regimes, North Korea. You've been watching the Newsmakers Review the Week with me, Imran Gupta. As always, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.